Opportunities abound for the interdisciplinarity of LIS to extend more deeply into cultural and feminist studies because these social science fields provide powerful and important social context for information about people that can help frame how the information is organized and made available. To date, much of the attention to information organization, storage, and retrieval processes has been influenced and, more importantly, funded by scientific research needs stemming from World War II and the Cold War. The adoption of critical race theory as a stance in the field would mean examining the beliefs about the neutrality and objectivity of the entire field of LIS and moving toward undoing racist classification and knowledge management practice. Such a stance would be a major contribution that could have impact on the development of new approach to organizing and accessing knowledge about marginalized groups. If the information retrieval priority of making access to record information efficient and expedient is the guiding process in the development of technical systems from database to web search engines, then what are the distinguishing data markers that define information about racialized people and women in the United States? What have primarily been missing from the field of information science and, to a lesser degree, library science are the issues of representation that are most often researched in the fields of African American studies, gender studies, communications, and increasingly digital media studies. Information organization is a matter of socio-political and historical processes that serve particular interest. A short history of misrepresentation in classifying people. In order to understand how racial and gender representations in Google search express the same traditional bias that exists in other organizational systems, an overview of how women and non-whites have been historically represented in information categorization environments is in order. The issue of misrepresentations of women and people of color in classification systems has been significantly critiqued. Hope A. Olson, an associate dean and professor at the School of Information Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, has contributed among the most important theories on the social construction of classifications that many of us in the field assign to our students as a way of fostering greater awareness about the power that library, museum, and information professionals hold. Those who have the power to design systems, classification, or technical, hold the ability to prioritize hierarchical schemes that privilege certain types of information over others. An example of these biases included the cataloging of people as subjects in the Library of Congress subject headings LCSH, which serve as a foundational and authoritative framework for categorizing information in libraries in the United States. The LCSH has been noted to be fraught with bias, and the radical librarian Sanford Berman details the ways that this bias has reflected Western perspectives. Since the first edition of Library of Congress subject headings appeared 60 years ago, American and other libraries have increasingly relied on this list as the chief authority, if not the sole basis, for subject cataloging. There can be no quarrel about the practical necessity for such labor-saving, worry-reducing work, nor, abstractly, about its value as a global standardizing agent, as a means for achieving some uniformity in an area that would otherwise be chaotic. But in the realm of headings that deal with people and cultures, in short with humanity, the LC list can only satisfy parochial, jingoistic Europeans and North Americans, white-hued, at least nominally Christian and preferably Protestant, in faith, comfortably situated in the middle and higher income brackets, largely domiciled in suburbia, fundamentally loyal to the established order, and heavily imbued with a transcendent, incomparable glory of Western civilization. Eventually, the LCSH abolished labels such as quote-unquote yellow peril and quote-unquote Jewish question, or made substitutions in the catalog changing race questions or Negroes to race relations and Afro-Americans. But the establishment of such headings and the subsequent decade-long struggles to undo them underscored Berman's point about Western racial bias. In fact, it was Berman who led the field in calling for anti-racist interventions into library catalogs in the 1970s. Patriarchy, like racism, has been the fundamental organizing point of view in the LCSH. The ways in which women were often categorized was not much better, with headings such as women as accountants in lieu of the now preferred women accountants. Women were consistently an aberration to the assumed maleness of a subject area. Furthermore, efforts at self-identity from the perspective of marginalized and oppressed groups, such as the Roma or Romanis, cannot escape the stigmatizing categorization of their culture as gypsies, even though their see also designation to rogues and vagabonds was finally dropped from the LCSH. A host of other problematic naming conventions, including Oriental instead of Asian, and the location of Christianity at the top of the religious hierarchy, with all the deviations moving toward the classification of primitive, suggests that there is still work to be done in properly addressing and classifying groups of people around identity. Olson says, the problem of bias in classification can be linked to the nature of classification as a social construct. It reflects the same biases as the culture that creates it. These types of biases are often seen in offline information practices where conquest is a means of erasing the history of one dynasty or culture by the subsequent regime. Olson's research has already shown that classifications reflect the philosophical and ideological presumptions of dominant cultures over subordinate cultures or groups. For example, in traditional Dewey Decimal Classification, DDC, over 80% of its religion section is devoted exclusively to Christianity, even though there are greater numbers of other religious texts and literature. Olson points to the Library of Congress classification, LCC, and its biases toward North American and European countries in volumes on the law, with far fewer allocations of space for Asia, Eurasia, Africa, the Pacific area, and Antarctica, reflecting the discourse of the powerful and the presumption of marginality for all others. In this respect, Olson reminds us that the ordering of information provided in classification schemes tended to reflect the most mainstream version of these relationships because classificatory structures are developed by the most powerful discourse in a society. The result is the marginalization of concept outside of the mainstream. In other words, the most mainstream, example, white, heterosexual, Christian, middle class, controlling regimes in society will privilege themselves and diminish or subdue all others in the organization of what constitutes legitimate knowledge. When we inherit privilege, it is based on a massive knowledge regime that foregrounds the structural inequalities of the past, buttressed by vast stores of text, image, and sounds saved in archives, museums, and libraries. Certainly, classification systems have some boundaries and limits, as they are often defined in whole by what is include and what is exclude. In the case of most library database in the United States, Eurocentrism will dominate the canons of knowledge. Knowledge management reflects the same social bias that exists in society because human beings are at the epicenter of information curation. These practices of the past are part of the present, and only committed and protracted investments in repairing knowledge stores to reflect and recenter all communities can cause a shift toward equality and inclusion in the future. This includes reconciling our brutal past rather than obscuring or minimizing it. In this way, we have yet to fully confront our histories and reconstruct libraries and museums toward reconciliation and reparation. Search engines, like a database of information, are equally bound, limited to providing only information based on what is indexed within the network. who has access to provide information in the network certainly impact whether information can be found and surfaced to anyone looking for it. Olson's research points to the way that some discourse are represented with more power, even if their social classifications are relatively small. In North America society, taking away women, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, French Canadians, Native peoples, Asian Americans, lesbians and gay men, people with disabilities, anyone who is not Christian, working class and poor people, and so forth, one is left with a very small core. An image that shows the complexity of these overlapping categories is that of a huge Venn diagram with many sets limited by Boolean and. The white and male and straight and European and Christian and middle class and able-bodied and Anglo-mainstream becomes a very small minority, and each set implies what it is not. The implication of this image is not every person, not every discourse, not every concept has equal weight. Some discourse simply wield more power than others.